I was thinking about this thing, and it occurred to me that, I was listening to this podcast called Philosophize This, and that guy goes through a bunch of philosophers and explains everything that they did. And he recently started on Michel Foucault, and I basically use this as an easy way to just understand every philosopher that I want to learn about, but I'm either too lazy or just don't want to read their books because they're too long or whatever. And this guy does a really good job at summarizing and explaining philosophy concepts. So I listen to this podcast a lot. It's on YouTube too for those people who are interested. So I listened to this podcast, and it's about Michel Foucault, and he wrote all these books concerning just like the superstructure of society that we've come to accept, like with the criminal justice system and psychiatry and things like that. And it occurred to me that since postmodernism came into its own and became a thing, we really haven't had any deconstructions of the superstructures we have around us today. And I don't think that's a good thing. Because some of the ways that he talks about psychiatry and the criminal justice system reveals deeper truths about the system themselves. And I think we could use that about a few systems that we have in our world today. Now, what I'm going to say may not be all that revelatory, but it might be useful to get you thinking about the systems that we've come to take for granted, and maybe a little more about why we've come to take them for granted, and maybe what implications these systems have on our daily lives, right? So the first one I want to talk about is social media. Social media has become something of a scapegoat for every problem that society faces today. And I think for good reason, right? It's because it's so broad-reaching. It's so wide in its scope that it's basically applicable to most things that we do on a day-to-day basis. Like everything from you waking up in the morning and then checking your feed first thing in the day, or checking for directions. Those are based on directions that people have used before and then run through an AI, and then now we have this auto navigational system. And then also live traffic reports are based on user feedback, just saying. And also recipes, and also figuring out what you want to watch when you come back from work, or just the life outside of the life that happens at work. When you see the people around you, you know them on a surface level based on your work, but then they also have another presence online that you may or may not know, or when you do know, changes your opinion of who they are in the way that you perceived them initially. And this other existence is something that we haven't really come to terms with, I don't think, as a species. And it's something that we're kind of struggling with, I think, just because it's so counterintuitive to what most of our history has been. Because most of our history has been just being alone in the woods, or alone in a forest, or alone in the desert, or whatever. There hasn't really been that much time since we became social to now where we've adapted, I think, to, or our brains have adjusted to the idea of us being social animals. And we are social in the way that we need a family unit or whatever, a group of people around us. No man is an island and all that. But I don't think we've adjusted to how wide our group now is. And I think a lot of the backlash to certain things, or the reason certain things are happening now, is because we haven't adjusted to how wide our circle has become, right? Because it used to be that our circle was just our family, but now I think slowly it's expanding from the largest group identity we held before, which was nation, to something more all-encompassing, i.e. world. We have one world identity. And this is something that I took from reading Mohsin Hamid's book Exit West, which I thought was pretty shit, and didn't really address this idea at all. But he tried to address this idea, which is, what if there were magic portals all over the world which just let anyone live anywhere, right? And I think this has to do with what you call the privilege of birth. And social media is slowly revealing that even if you don't think you have any privilege of birth, you do have more privilege of birth than you previously thought. And I think the vast movement of civil rights has been towards equalizing people so that no matter what privilege of birth they hold, they're not treated as, or disprivilege or whatever, disadvantage of birth that they're born with, that they're not treated as lesser than anyone else, because that's something you can't change about yourself. if you decide to be a dumbass and like crash your car into people, you can be prosecuted for that because that's something that you made a choice to do, and you can make a choice not to do that. But if you're born black or born brown or whatever, that's not a choice you made. So you can't be punished for that. It's just not fair, you know? That's like my breakdown of that. So the current privilege of birth that we're dealing with is like alternative sexuality, like gay people and stuff like that. And most countries, I think, still are not caught up to accepting gay people as just another type of people. And I think that will change in the coming years just because there's so much more exposure to them. I don't think Western media or Hollywood in general gets enough credit for exposing the majority of the world to new ideas. Like when Friends was on in the 90s, there was a lesbian couple in Friends, you know? And for, I think, the vast majority of people who saw Friends in the third world or the developing world, that may have been their only exposure, quote unquote, to gay people in their entire lives, because it's so taboo, the topic, and just the people are so marginalized that one, they don't reveal themselves, or two, they pretend to be straight or whatever, like as normal as possible, and they just repress, you know, and that's not a sustainable model. It ultimately leads to problems. But just Friends, when you see a lesbian couple on Friends and you go, oh hey, look, that's a thing, they're normal people just like us. I think there's a version of this when somebody did a documentary about this black TV presenter in Japan, which Japan is like a homogenous ethnicity country, so they don't really have that many outside people in the country. So when they get to see people who look different, and they ultimately see that they were all the same, you know, it leads to more tolerance, especially when they're exposed at a young age, right? When you're watching Friends, oh my god, this thing. Focus, you piece of shit. What about now? It's just refusing. So when you're exposed to something like that, when you're 9 years old or 8 years old or whatever, you get more time to like understand these people are normal. And currently, I think the privilege of birth that we're tackling is where you're born, right? Because where you're born can determine a lot more about how your life will end up than what race you are, I think. If you're of a lower race, quote unquote lower race, in a modern first world country, your life will probably be better than if you were a white person and you lived in a third world country, assuming normal wealth and all that. And that's something that I think the world is starting to understand is a thing. And hopefully that goes in a way that will eventually be solved. I don't know how it will be solved, but hopefully something happens to that regard, right? So if you're born in a third world country like Rwanda or like any of the lower African countries or anything like that, you just start with a supreme disadvantage in life, right? You started off at a level so far below everyone in the modern civilized rich world that you have to do so much more work just to make up for that initial disadvantage. Like, you probably don't have access to the quality of education that you would have in the West. You probably don't have access to the internet, or limited access, if any. I think cell phones are doing a lot to combat this, because cell phones are so decentralized. You don't need like a very wide-reaching infrastructure for cell phones to be used. You don't need cable run to every single residence. You only need a tower for every like however many square kilometers. So you can have deployment from the government without needing like a vast amount of time and effort to be invested. Like, you just need to roll out cables to the towers, and the towers beam the internet down to everyone else. And this is something that we're seeing a lot in countries like India, where people don't even have running water, but they have cell phones, because cell phones are so easy to acquire and easy to use. And there are companies feeding the trend of making cheaper and cheaper cell phones specifically for this market, because they know the advantage that it will bring these people, and these people are willing to pay for it. So when you have technology like this that's reaching out to people like this, you have more exposure to like voices that were never heard before. So you know what someone's life is like in Zimbabwe or whatever. Like, you know that that's a person that exists, and you have to think about them where you might not have had to think about them before. And because of this, we're seeing like this fallacy that lies at the under, like at the, it's like a fundamental fallacy that we've made. It's that because we're born in this country, we deserve certain advantages. And as an immigrant myself, I can speak to this. The quality of life here in Canada is much higher than anywhere else in the world. And it's the small things. It's not like roads and electricity and water. It's like somebody comes to mow the grass on the side of the pavement if you live in a nice area. You know, like the society pays for landscaping. It pays to keep everything looking pretty. It cleans up the trash. You know, like none of this happens anywhere in India because there's not enough money. There's just not enough money. There's too many people. And for this amount of work to be put into just maintaining the look of a neighborhood would be wasteful, because there are people literally dying of starvation 5 minutes from wherever you are. So it puts everything into like a more cynical perspective, I think, where you can't like do that extra thing because there's so much that needs to be done before you even think about doing that, that any attempt you make to match a first world quality of life is just immediately shut down. And that's not a bad thing. It makes sense, because when you live in a third world country like that, you have to address your own privilege, which is that you even get to be on the internet to see other people. And the internet is more widespread now, so that privilege is more shared. But like, if you have a computer, you're in the top 1%. I think there was a statistic that came out recently, which was that if you are on the internet, or 93% of the people on the internet are in the top 1% of worldwide income. So literally everyone you interact with on the internet is in the 1% of the world. So you have to take that into perspective too before you start making like sweeping generalizations about how widespread the internet is, because the other 99% of the world don't have the internet. It's just not a thing. Like, and I think as cell technology becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and it's just on an ever downward march, and phones become like the primary computing device for most people in the world, this is going to become less of a thing. And I think as it becomes less of a thing, we'll become increasingly aware of how the borders that we've drawn around our countries are unsustainable. They may have been sustainable before because you had so much money, but the internet effectively means that anything you can do in the US, you can pay someone else in whatever else country to do, as long as they have a decent internet connection. And when that happens, the economy becomes one of like whichever currency is more valuable. Like if your currency is more valuable, people want to be paid in your currency, right? But because all of your currency is going to countries outside of your country, because it's more advantageous for you to outsource your labor than to do it in your own country because you save so much money. This is happening, by the way. This has already happened. Outsourcing is a thing. But I'm saying it's going to become more and more of a thing as the internet becomes of higher quality and is more available in lower income places like this. And if you go to like a video editing on demand site or something like that, you can already see that the majority of people offering their skills on such a site are not from the US. Like people from the US don't want to be paid $10 to make a video. But if you convert that $10 into whatever local currency you're sending it to, that becomes much more substantial, and they're willing to work for a low fee like that because it's worth it for them in their country if they do that work for you in your country. And the only reason that you're able to afford that is because you're being paid in whatever currency of the country that you live in, which is more valuable because your country is more rich and has been historically, because it was either got its wealth from imperialism / colonialism and exploitation of primary resources in other countries that were systematically made to be second class, and which have continued to be second class through the 20th century, just through the establishment of, or the unavailability of, migration to more rich countries, or limited migration. And because of this, these countries have had to compete with countries that have been established for 400, 500 years and have had no significant governmental upheaval in all that time. So they've had one solid economic policy from the beginning, and they've had to compete with these countries with less than 50 years of experience. And they've done kind of a good job mostly, but they're going to be behind. And that's the way this system is set up to be, because the other countries, the imperialist countries, started off with an advantage from the beginning. and they will always hold that lead. You can't really catch up. The system is not designed to catch up or to help you catch up. So when you're looking at this and you go, oh hey, there's like this fundamental fallacy that we've based our society off of, what do we do to address it, right? And eventually I think, and birth rates globally are decreasing as well. So this is not a new trend or anything, but global birth rates have been decreasing forever. 2.1 is a replacement rate, by the way, and half of the countries in the world, the majority of them being developed countries, are already below this replacement rate. That means their population is actively decreasing, except for migration. And migration doesn't make up for this totally, because I'm pretty sure migration rates in most countries are far below what you need to replace the native population, based on how the birth rate has been decreasing. So you have these countries whose populations are decreasing just over time, and they're becoming older and older societies, and because older people are living longer, they're majority old. But old people don't contribute to the economy because they don't work, and they spend only off what they earned before. So their spending amount is limited, and they don't earn anything, which means they're actively draining your welfare system. And eventually, when your old population gets too high, your welfare system becomes unsustainable because there's not enough young people putting money into the system. So when you don't have enough young people, what happens is, 1, you have to kick old people off their welfare. 2, you have to raise the retirement age. Or 3, you have to increase migration. Those are the 3 things that solve this problem. So there's been like a widespread anti-immigrant sentiment across most of the Western world over the past 5 to 6 years. Especially since the economic collapse and since outsourcing in China became this economic superpower, people feel rightfully threatened that if they send their jobs elsewhere, or if people are coming to their country to take their jobs, that they will be replaced somehow. And this is obviously based off of some kind of nationalistic pride, nationalistic identity that they feel is being displaced by people who are not like them coming into their country. And this is especially true for generally homogeneous societies like the Scandinavian countries and like Japan, where immigration is generally discouraged and people generally have not wanted to immigrate to these countries. But now, with the global economy the way that it is, people are looking for opportunities wherever they get them. So they're willing to migrate wherever it takes because they need or they want to pursue that higher economic opportunity no matter the costs. Because these immigrants who leave their home country and go to other countries, they're sacrificing a lot to do that. They're giving up their whole life. They're giving up all their friends and all the life that they had before moving to this country just to pursue higher economic opportunity, right? And they're willing to make all the sacrifice, but the people in the home country or the country that they're emigrating to don't see it that way. They see it as people who are coming to steal their opportunity. But this has been shown before that generally immigrants are good economically for whatever society, mostly because more people are always good for any economy. The more people you have in an economy, the more money is coming in, the more money is going out. More money is always good for an economy, right? And the majority of the problems that they have in the first place is because they don't have enough working population. Now, all of this is only a problem if you consider national borders to be a thing, right? If you just told the world population, go and live where you want, where would they go? They would go to the areas that pay the highest, which would be Europe and most of North America, except Mexico. The peso is not very valuable. So if the entire population of India tried to immigrate to one of these countries, it would be catastrophic. That's not sustainable. So because the system we have now is based off of fallacies made over hundreds of years, you can't fix it in one day. There's no way that this problem can be fixed through one decision. It's not going to happen. It's not even possible. We shouldn't even expect that. It might be very idealistic to say, hey, just take the lines out, people can go wherever they want. And the Eurozone kind of tried to do something similar to this by having one common currency for the entirety of Europe and saying a citizen from whatever country can move to whatever country they want in Europe legally. And this, I think, was kind of a landmark decision, but it has not ended well, primarily because the local states were preserved, right? Instead of blending into one actual huge government, they've kind of just let that huge government dictate their economic policy and relatively rested and not had it intervene too much in local policy. This means that if one state fails, the other states have to cover for them. And this is what happened when Greece went bankrupt. They still haven't fixed their economy. There's still almost more than 1/4 of their population is unemployed, which is horrible, by the way. And people are actually having to face the fact that they may not have enough food to give to their family. Like, that's not something that we expect to be told in a Western country that has so much money. And the Eurozone has not helped this at all. But what if it was the opposite way? What if it was like, there are no states, there's just one huge multi-country spanning government? What would happen then? It would be like, there's one currency. So the currency problem is solved. And I don't see any other way to solve the currency problem other than to have one common currency, because that's the only way to make sure that people won't just go to wherever the currency is most valuable. So wherever you go, if there's a global minimum wage of a set amount of the common currency of the world, then you'll have people going to the places where they want to live. And ultimately, I think this is the most sustainable model. But there are so many steps that we have to take to get there that I don't think it can be accomplished anytime soon. Keeping it the way it is, and with the increased awareness that we're about to get from the internet becoming much more common, I think is a disaster. It's just setting up for multiple revolutions all around the world when people realize they've been dealt a shit hand and they want to take back some of the power that they feel that they've lost just because they're born in a certain country. And nationalistic pride plays some part in it. They want their country to be on the top tier of all the nation states in the world. And they feel that the current government won't do that for them, so they'll try to take the power into their own hands. It's only natural. It's happened before. It's not something we haven't seen before. And I don't think that's something that we want, right? Because of the way that modern warfare is trending towards, Google is currently working on an AI killer robot. They don't call it a killer robot. The robot doesn't take the decision to kill people. A human has to do that, but ultimately it is the robot that does the killing. Feels like they kind of missed the point on that one. But with all this automated weaponry or machinery of war that's going to be put out into the world shortly, within the next 5 years, by the way, DARPA even has a laser research project. So we're going to have laser guns shooting down people from drones. How's that for Star Wars, right? You didn't think it would go this way, did you? Anyway, with all this, any revolution or any, for example, currently there's an illegal immigrant problem in the US. Mexican citizens are crossing the border into the US just because it's one of the largest shared land borders in the world, just to seek better economic opportunity. And this is something that you don't see with Canadian citizens fleeing to the US, right? It's not because Mexicans want to live in the US. That's not it. The only reason they want to live in the US is so they can support their family and have a better life. They're immigrants. They're economic immigrants. They're looking for better opportunity, right? And the only reason they're looking for that is because they don't have it in their home country. If you try to fix the problem by making it harder to get into the country, you're not addressing the root of the problem. There's no Canadian-US border wall for a reason. Canada has a good high-value currency, and they pay their workers well because there's a lot more money up here. The only way to solve this immigration problem is by investing heavily. In the current paradigm, I'm not talking about new wave, no borderness. In the current paradigm is to invest heavily in the Mexican economy. That's the only way. And this is something that they tried to do with the new NAFTA, or I thought they were trying to do, but it turns out they haven't, or they haven't revealed the details of it. So even if they have, as of the time of this recording, I don't know, or the world hasn't been told, is they tried to make a global minimum wage. Like, they tried to make a North American minimum wage that all countries or all companies working in these 3 countries who use NAFTA would have to adhere to. And they tried to do this, and I don't think it flew. And I think it was partially because it would make the union stronger, and either the governments didn't want that or the companies didn't want that, and they told the governments that they didn't want that. So I think this has been shut down. But this is the only way to artificially raise the quality of living in Mexico, so people don't feel like they have to put their lives at risk to cross the border into the US. The jobs that these first generation migrants are getting in the US are not good jobs. They're not getting paid all that much, and most of the time they're getting paid under the table. This means they either get paid below minimum wage or below the effective minimum wage of whatever state or county they live in. This means, one, it makes it much harder for them to make ends meet when they're in the US, so they have to work either 2 jobs or many more hours because they're undocumented. They don't have any restrictions on how many hours they can work as a normal worker would in the US because of labor laws. So they don't want this. This is not something that they actively chose out. The only reason that they're doing this is because, one, they want to get a job so they can have a better quality of life than being unemployed, and two, make a better life for their kids. Now let's address that point. Now let's imagine that you've set a universal minimum wage for all of North America. That's Canada, US, and Mexico. Now what do? Well, now there will be less people trying to cross the border into Mexico, and you've kind of turned the corner on this. Like, DACA will already have to be a thing. I don't think you can reverse the clock on this. The ball has been dropped, so you have to take responsibility for the people who are already there and are by law American citizens. You can't do anything about that. This is a mistake that should have been fixed decades ago when the problem first started, and they realized what the problem was in the first place. So to make better opportunities for their kids, make a separate immigration quota for education students who go to the US and have them pay domestic fees, right? This is very important, one, that you make a separate quota for Mexican students because that specifically addresses their needs and they have the greatest opportunity to become undocumented immigrants in the US, so you have to address their problem separately. That's number one. Number two, they pay domestic fees because nobody in the fucking world can afford US international fees. It's not a thing. So if you want to go to college, right now, if you go to college in the US as a Mexican undocumented immigrant, you pay domestic fees. So you want to keep that advantage because you're a naturalized or either just born American citizen, you pay domestic fees. So you want to keep that same fee structure for the people who are immigrating so they have incentive to come to your country because you want smart people in your country, by the way. And two, so they don't think of that as an advantage to cross the border. That's part two. What's part three? Part three is you have to stop the drug cartels. There's only one way that the US can immediately solve the drug problem, and that's to legalize all drugs, right? Now, this is probably the most radical part of this, unless you're a staunch anti-immigrant person, this is probably the most radical part of this proposal, and that would be legalizing all drugs. But hear me out, right? First of all, marijuana is already illegal most of the place, and I think there's going to be a federal thing that people vote for to make marijuana recreationally legal all across the country. So the precedent is kind of there. Now you're just arguing over semantics. Just because you legalize drugs doesn't mean that more people will overdose and die. If anything, people will less likely die of heroin overdoses because heroin will be more easily available. Or I don't think it will be even more easily available. I just think it will be so regulated that if you know someone has a history of drug abuse, you can just deny them the thing. Like, if you want to use it, you have to use it responsibly. And it makes more tax money and all. The arguments for drug legalization have been made. And no, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a universally appealing proposal. I just think it's a necessary evil to counteract all the other reasons that the citizens of Mexico feel inclined or feel compelled to illegally immigrate to the US. And that's violence in their countries from not even just Mexico, like Peru, Guatemala, Colombia, all these places. All because of the US appetite for drugs. So if you're just keeping it illegal, I don't think you're addressing the problem. And I wasn't even going to talk about this in the first place. But another recent trend, apparently, there's this movie from India based on this, where Indian citizens can actually go to Mexico without a visa. It's a visa on arrival type situation. So you can go to Mexico without a visa, and then from there, they try to illegally immigrate to the US, just because they know they'll have so much more opportunity in the US than they do in their home country. Because this is the currency problem, by the way. India has plenty of tech jobs, but it also has millions and millions of people competing for those tech jobs. And there aren't enough to go around, one. Two, they're compensated much less than similar jobs in the US. That's two, and that's primarily because of the currency problem that I outlined before. If your currency is much more just inherently valuable, you're not going to pay 50 times as much in the local currency because things are not inflating that way. Like it's not a one-to-one, you know? Things are cheaper to buy because your currency is cheaper. That means you get paid less. That's just the way that it is. But it also means that if you want to make more money, your opportunities are limited unless you go to a place where the currency is just more valuable. If your currency is 50 times more valuable, that doesn't mean your cost of living is 50 times higher. It doesn't work like that. And conversely as well. If your currency is 50 times less valuable, it doesn't mean your cost of living is 50 times less. That's just the way that it works. That's just global economics. You can go check this for yourself. Bread does not cost 50 times more in the US than it does in India, right? Despite $1 being worth 50 rupees or whatever. So to fix this, that's a much bigger problem, and you can't fix that right away. Like I already outlined, like the currency problem is too big, and we need a much larger superstructure and a common currency all around the world to deal with that. But the Mexico problem, I think, can be fixed within a decade if the will was there. I think we could have fixed one part of it already with the current NAFTA negotiations, but nobody really felt the need to do that. So we're stuck with a mediocre NAFTA yet again, and it doesn't use the potential of what a three-country trade agreement could be. A free trade agreement between Mexico, US, and Canada. You know, like exploiting the other lower costs of production in Mexico to artificially, I'm not saying market demanded, artificially raise the salaries of workers in Mexico to incentivize them to stay there. And also, I guess, in a way to incentivize companies to make new factories in Mexico. Because the only cost that's equal with the other two countries is labor. The other costs are much, much lower in Mexico, right? You have to pay way more for a zoning license for a warehouse or factory in the US than you would in Mexico. That's just pesos. And I'm not claiming that all this is just immediately implementable and just it will solve every problem and no new problems will arise. I'm not saying that. Obviously, new problems will come up. New problems always do come up. It's just something you have to live with when you're working with economics. If you do something here, 3 years later, something else breaks. But I do think these are some steps that you could take to fix the problem for now and to take a step towards fixing the problem forever, which I've outlined before, you know? I guess tell me how I'm wrong. That's the only thing I can think of. And we started on a completely different topic, but we've ended on something else. So maybe I'll go talk about that topic later. Okay, peace.